Just days after the ceasefire agreement, Israel launched a large-scale offensive named Iron Wall on the northern occupied West Bank city of Jenin, killing at least 7 Palestinians at the time of release. Before that, the Palestinian Authority ruling over the area had already launched a massive assault against Palestinian resistance fighters over multiple weeks, killing several unarmed civilians. Israel argued that they couldn't properly root them out and took over. Now, why would the so-called Palestinian government attack Palestinian fighters? How come it found itself on the same side as Israel? The answer to this question not only cuts to the heart of the political forces at play, but also sheds light on the history of the Palestinian liberation struggle, a history marked by heroic resistance, internal warfare, collaboration, and betrayal. The Palestinian Authority, or short PA, is regarded by many as a junior partner of the Zionist occupation in Palestine. Just this year, it has put blame on Hamas for the genocide, accused them of using civilians as human shields, and of stealing human aid. That's right, this is Palestinian politicians saying this, not Israeli ones. Its president said that the PA is aiming to rule over Gaza, aligning with plans outlined by the United States. In this video series, we're gonna go into the history of how the leaders of one of the most formidable Palestinian resistance forces in history turned into collaborators with Zionism and US imperialism, entering into war with other Palestinian organizations, becoming one of the greatest obstacles of Palestinian liberation.
وارجم أعداءك بالنار واهتف بالصوت الهدار الثورة نهج الأحرار.
The Nakba dealt a devastating blow to the Palestinian national movement. 70% of the Palestinian population was expelled, around 80% of its land conquered, with hundreds of thousands forced to live in refugee camps in surrounding Arab countries or in their own homeland. The majority of Palestine was annexed by a settler minority, while the remaining territory came under the control of Egypt or Jordan. In my videos on the Nakba, we explored how the Hashemite dynasty, the British-backed ruling elite of Jordan, played a pivotal role through collaborating with the Zionists. Despite the fact that Jordan's military forces were more than capable of defending far larger portions of Palestinian territory, they decided to secure a share of the land for themselves. Frustration among Palestinians grew as Arab governments failed to both confront Israel and address the refugee crisis. This discontent spurred the revival of the Palestinian nationalist movement. In 1958, a group of Palestinian intellectuals and professionals who had lived and studied in the oil-rich Arab states and who largely came from Gaza established the first cell of Harakat al-Tahrir al-Watani al-Filistiniya, short Fatah, a movement which would go on to shape the history of Palestine to this day, declaring in one of its founding documents, "Freedom is taken, not granted." It explained that the Arab armies during the Nakba in 1948 had failed because the Arab states eliminated the effective Palestinian forces from the battle. The Palestinian masses were robbed of the will to act. And that, through impotent bourgeois mentality, a number of Arab leaders have exploited the Palestinian cause for their private benefit. It saw Palestinian rights as being denied through the Zionist and Western narrative that the Arabs wanted the same thing to happen to Jews as the European Nazis, when in fact they compared Palestinian resistance to colonialism to European resistance against the Nazi occupation. From Frantz Fanon's writings on anti-colonial struggle, it emphasized the liberating effect of violence on the psyche of the oppressed. Founder Khalil al-Wazir later compared their fight to the struggle of black people in the US or the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Inspired by Algeria's war of independence against French settler colonialism, its founders proclaimed armed struggle as the means to liberate all of Palestine. Among them, a certain man who would become the face of Palestinian resistance for several decades. Many of its founders came from the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, One of them, who according to some was a member, was 20-year-old engineering student Muhammad Abdel Raouf al-Qutwa al-Husseini, better known as Yasser Arafat. Arafat was born in Cairo to a Palestinian father and Egyptian mother. As a student, he read the works of Theodor Herzl and got engaged with Arab nationalist ideas. During the Nakba, Arafat left university to participate in the struggle against the Israeli forces and the establishment of Israel. Rather than aligning with the Palestinian Fedayeen, he is believed to have fought alongside the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, a critical area of Egyptian military operations. After the Zionists finished up their first major phase of ethnic cleansing, he returned to Cairo, where he got a degree in civil engineering and became the leader of the powerful General Union of Palestinian Students. During Israel's French and British-supported attack on the Suez Canal in 1956, he served in the Egyptian army, and the idea to form Fatah came in reaction to this war. The future founders were troubled by the Egyptian authorities' capacity to completely stop Fedayeen attacks after Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 1957. This led them to conclude that prioritizing independent action should be a central focus of their efforts. By the time Arafat moved to Kuwait, he had abandoned the prevailing belief that only pan-Arab forces could achieve Palestinian liberation. Instead, he became convinced that Palestinians needed to lead their own struggle, independent of Arab states, and that Palestinian liberation itself could serve as a catalyst for broader Arab unity, and not the other way around. This approach led him to avoid accepting significant funding from the major Arab governments, aiming to maintain Fatah's independence. He sought their support without creating tensions by steering clear of ideological affiliations. So Fatah was a body that drew in people with different ideologies, Islamic, communist, or Arab nationalist, all united by the goal of the liberation of Palestine. To secure its financial foundation, he turned to affluent Palestinians living in Gulf states like Qatar, where he met Director of Personnel in the Emirates Civil Service and recruited him to the movement. You've likely heard his name, Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of Fatah, president of the Palestinian Authority, and the quote, chief Palestinian collaborator today. But Fatah was not yet in a position to claim representation of the Palestinian people. The organization who did that was founded not by Palestinians, but by other Arab states, in Cairo in 1964, at the first summit meeting of the Arab League. Its name, Palestine Liberation Organization, short PLO. Its legislative body, or its parliament, is called the Palestinian National Council, PNC. The PLO would later establish the PA. Today these structures overlap in crucial ways. The president of the PA was always the same person as the head of the PLO, for instance. Back then, Palestinian and Syrian fighters urged to take up arms again after the Nakba. But other Arab states, particularly Egypt under President Abdel Nasser, believed it was not the appropriate time for confrontation. The PLO thus became a body to channel the Arab government's calculations and subject to their control. As a founding member of Fatah put it, we considered the PLO to be an Arab instrument and its military wing a part of the Arab armies. In view of our experience with the Arabs and our deep lack of trust towards them, we feared that the PLO would kill or divert the awakening of our people. The Fatah founders also correctly analyzed that the PLO leadership was mostly composed of, quote, the sons of upper-class families and traditional figures. But they also realized that the PLO enjoyed Arab legitimacy, and this was important, and that starting armed action was now more urgent to not lose legitimacy to the PLO. They could not rely on fate, however, and thus aimed to take control of it, to revolutionize it from within. Fatah also enjoyed some international recognition, for instance, by the newly liberated Algeria, who would train Palestinians in guerrilla warfare, such as students and workers arriving from Germany. The base there also enabled forming connections with other liberation movements. Wazir would meet the foreign minister of the South Vietnamese National Liberation Front, or Che Guevara, who promised Cuban support. Wazir and Arafat also met with Chairman Mao Zedong and were later informed that China decided to boycott Israel. With this, the Communist Party of China followed the strategic thrust set out by the Communist International to defeat imperialism, which was to link up the proletarian struggle for socialism in industrialized countries with national liberation movements in the colonized or semi-colonized world, as they undercut the imperialist capitalists' extra profits. Lenin had stated that socialists should render determined support to the more revolutionary elements in the bourgeois democratic movements for national liberation in these countries and assist their rebellion, and if need be, their revolutionary war against the imperialist powers that oppress them. The PLO leadership, meanwhile, didn't like the increasing political challenge from Fatah, especially after Nasser repeated openly that he had no plan to liberate Palestine. Apparently, the first PLO chairman was one of many Arab leaders who told Nasser to stop saying such things, not least because it would undermine his own legitimacy. But the war that was about to break out would fundamentally reshape the Palestinian national movement in ways that would endure to this day. According to Israeli propaganda, which of course happens to be the accepted viewpoint in the West, the Six-Day War simply forced Israel to occupy the Golan Heights, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip due to so-called security concerns. The same excuse is found when it comes to the territorial conquest during the Nakba before, or to Gaza and Syria today. Israel just has to control these lands, the story goes, until a more quote-unquote reasonable Palestinian position emerges, one that abandons armed resistance, or, put bluntly, accepts defeat. After the Nakba, the Israeli military and political leadership were not happy at all, even though they had just conquered 80% of the land. That's because they clearly stated that they wanted all of it, from the river to the sea. The big reason why this could not be fulfilled was the agreement with Jordan, as talked about in the Nakba videos. The principal Zionist leader during that period was the quote-unquote leftist Zionist, Israel founder David Ben-Gurion, who regarded the decision to allow Jordan's annexation of the West Bank Bechia Ledorot, a fatal historical mistake, which future generations will regret. So while Israel only took the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, the plans to do so were already in existence for several decades. Meanwhile, the Arab masses in the surrounding countries were frustrated with the Arab government's obvious unwillingness to defend Palestine. In 1952, the Egyptian Free Officers overthrew the British-backed monarchy in Cairo, causing a major upheaval in the Arab world. These movements across the Arab world inspired hope for democracy and freedom from colonial influence, and gained support from the Soviet Union, a development that the United States obviously opposed. In Iraq, too, military officers seized power from the Hashemite monarchy. The British puppet family had ruled in this country as well. After the coup, the officers punished the military leaders for their unwillingness to defend Palestine during the Nakba. It was within this Cold War context that Israel sought an opportunity to rectify its fatal historical mistake. One powerful lobby, led by the so-called war heroes of 1948, Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan, pushed for a plan to stop the danger of Arab nationalism spreading to other countries, including Jordan, which involved Ben-Gurion contacting NATO to preemptively take over the West Bank. On the 5th of June, the war began, and by June 11th, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Both right-wing and so-called left-wing Zionists were captivated by euphoric fervor to quote-unquote liberate Jewish holy sites with no intention to leave. The well-known UN Security Council Resolution 242 demanded Israel to withdraw. This was one of the rare instances where a Security Council resolution condemning Israel was not vetoed by the United States. The only Palestinian force to fight during the war was the Palestine Liberation Army, PLA, which was formerly the PLO's armed wing, but in reality pretty much under the control of the Arab governments, predominantly Syria. The IDF detained about 6,000 PLO personnel in Gaza. The PLO chairman was blamed for making exaggerated claims and attempts to centralize control, leading to his resignation. But Fatah saw Arab defeat as an opportunity that allowed the Palestinian people to grasp its cause in its own hands for the first time since 1948. Just like the experiences in China or Vietnam, it hoped to establish a base for the revolutionary authority within the occupied territories. However, the center of its social activity and military command was based in other countries. One such influential branch was in Jordan, where the Fedayeen needed to relocate due to the occupation. It was not until the first Intifada in 1987 where the center of gravity moved back to Palestine. But discussions about strategy were overshadowed by another problem, a conflict between Fatah's military command and its central committee in Kuwait. Arafat received criticism for his undemocratic leadership style and his unchecked handling of funds. In order to resolve the dispute, they established a temporary central committee including those who criticized him. But Arafat's critics were not satisfied, some of whom went on to form a dissenting wing. This would not be the last time Arafat would face such criticism. The tempest brewing within his ranks was merely the first rumble of a far greater storm yet to come. But first, an upcoming battle would galvanize exponential support for Arafat's movement, making him the undisputed hero of the Palestinian people. The Six-Day War didn't only mean Arab defeat. For Palestinians, it was another catastrophe. Another 300,000 were expelled during what was termed the Nakba. After Israel occupied the West Bank, Fatah fighters established bases in the Jordanian border town of Karameh and immediately started combat operations, which quickly gained them increasing support. Confidently, they asserted that this made them the vanguard of the Palestinian people, calling for a people's war, and now even considered to form a new national front outside the PLO. In reality, Fatah tried to gain support from within the PLO to gain influence there. Meanwhile, Mahmoud Abbas raised funds, wrote articles and pamphlets, and worked to strengthen the organization's ties with people from the Gulf monarchies, positioning himself as a diplomatic figure within the movement, focused more on bureaucratic efforts, while leaders like Arafat engaged in armed actions. Fatah saw itself in a similar role as the FLN in Algeria, which through persistent revolutionary action could not just ask, but demand help from the Arab supporters. It aimed at, quote, imposing a revolutionary new strategy on the Arab states and to fight all the forces hostile to the revolution. This inevitably got them pressure from the Jordanian authorities. King Hussein warned against military activity that was not part of a comprehensive Arab plan. Fatah responded by calling for the liquidation of collaborators and addressed the masses in Jordan, arguing that distancing the Arab people from its vanguard role in the battle and reliance on classic warfare were among the direct reasons for the setback of June 1967. Fortunately for Fatah, many Jordanian soldiers ignored orders to act against them, and to the contrary, decided to side with them, even providing them information on Israeli troops or give them fire cover at the Jordanian River. The guerrillas became more and more popular, even forcing King Hussein to claim support for them in public. The PLO chairman even requested that Fatah become a member, and they soon did. But the Arab army commanders advised Arafat against confrontation. But the Fatah leadership argued that a deliberate act of steadfastness was essential to shatter the illusion of Israeli invincibility and to uplift the spirits of Palestinians and Arabs alike. Arafat replied, quote, "We want to persuade the world that there are those in the Arab nation who will not withdraw and flee. Let us die under the tracks of the tanks and change the course of history in our region." Fatah's approach worked, but they now had to face the Zionist onslaught. As they intensified their attacks on the occupier, Israel aimed to capture Arafat as retaliation. A leader of a certain leftist group, which we'll talk about in the next part, accused Fatah of adventurism and withdrew its contingent. On the morning of March 21, 1968, a massive Israeli force, backed by fighter jets, launched an assault on the town of Karameh. The under-equipped Palestinian guerrillas heroically resisted, and after one day, the Zionist troops were forced to retreat without capturing Arafat. Now, without the help of the Jordanian army, they could not have done so. But what was more important is that the myth of the invincible IDF was effectively shaken here at a place whose name could not have been more fitting, Karameh, meaning dignity. Furthermore, it reaffirmed the Fidayeen's approach to unite Arabs through resilience and not to regard military action as isolated, but as embedded within a broader political strategy. Military means served, quote, revolutionary fusion with the masses, closeness and confidence between different Arab forces, and elimination of those elements hostile to the armed resistance movement. Fatah's popularity now soared, with Arafat's photograph appearing on magazine covers. This victory inspired thousands of Palestinians, Arabs, and people from other nationalities, such as Kurds, people from across the globe, to join the ranks of the Fidayeen. Fatah was unstoppable and won a third of the seats in the PLO Executive Committee, quickly gaining influence in the organization. By 1969, it was in firm control, with Yasser Arafat being elected as the chairman, and remained in that position until his death. Its revised national charter now clearly reflected the influence of the Fidayeen, who identified Palestine as an indivisible territorial unit, asserting that armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. Thus, it is the overall strategy, not merely a tactical phase, and that Palestinians reject all solutions which are substitutes for the total liberation of Palestine. Throughout its history, from Al-Qassam in the 30s to Arafat in the 60s, it was those forces who proved their determination to fight that ultimately earned them the support and trust of a majority of Palestinians. The emerging legend of the heroic guerrilla had grown so influential that the Jordanian army had ended its blockade of the guerrilla bases. Unbelievably, even King Hussein felt compelled to declare in a televised address, quote, "We are all Fidayeen." Fatah was now the firmly established representative and earned the respect of the Palestinian people. It wouldn't take very long before many began to lose it again. While King Hussein acted as if he welcomed the Fatah bases set up in his country, in reality, the Jordanian elite began to ponder on the next steps to defeat the threat of rivaling PLO power, backed by a community of Palestinian refugees making up 70% of the country's population. The Arab heads of government now rushed to associate themselves with the guerrilla. Nasser invited Arafat to Cairo, promising him further military assistance and even Fatah's own radio frequency to broadcast daily in Egypt. The Egyptian General Intelligence Chief said, "We helped everyone until clear leaders proved themselves in the field, and it was Fatah that proved itself." Egypt was now the number 3 supplier of Fatah, number 2 was Algeria, and the main supplier was the People's Republic of China. Where was the Soviet Union? More on Soviet policy regarding Palestine in the next part. Thousands of students and volunteers from other Arab armies now flooded to Fatah, so much so that it had serious trouble adapting its quality to its quickly growing size. The office in Iraq alone reported 1,500 applicants each week. Many students who lacked experience were now supposed to be military commanders, while the former officers brought a more hierarchical mindset with them, clashing with the egalitarian culture of the guerrilla, which didn't know distinctions in formal rank, pay, and privileges. The power rivalry within Jordan soon escalated into all-out war, after which tensions within Fatah intensified. Arafat found himself navigating a precarious power struggle, carefully balancing rival factions to maintain his grip on control. The PLO leadership increasingly adopted a bureaucratic capitalist mode of operation, growing detached from the poorer segments of Palestinian society. Rifts began to emerge between the rank-and-file members and the leadership, as Arafat centralized control over PLO resources to consolidate his authority. This divide would deepen as Arafat began to entertain the idea of entering US-mediated talks with Israel, a move that would eventually spiral into full-fledged opportunism and then collaboration. But how did it come to this exactly? To understand, We must delve deeper into the war with Jordan and then the one in Lebanon. We must examine the maneuvering of Arafat's inner circle and contrast it with the leftist opposition both within and outside Fatah, and focus on one force in particular, a group that would soon openly accuse the face of the Palestinian resistance of betrayal. In the next part, we will look at the history of the organization that would rise to become the second largest force in the Palestinian liberation movement, an organization that declared Marxism-Leninism as its doctrine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or simply the PFLP.
من غزة من قدس العربي من غزة من قدس العربي من أسر النقمة والتعب من أسر النقمة والتعب اخرج كالريح ولا تهبي اخرج كالريح ولا تهبي يا جيل النخوة والغضب يا جيل النخوة والغضب وتدفق 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 وتدفق